Brian O'Toole is a non-resident senior fellow with the Atlantic Council Geo-Economic Center. He's an expert on economic sanctions and foreign policy. And he also worked at the U.S. Department of Treasury, where he helped manage the implementation of economic and financial sanctions programs. Hi, Brian. It's really, it's always a school day when I get a chance to talk to you.
Thanks for having me back, Dana.
So my son, because you and I were talking about our kids just a minute ago, my son asked me on the way to school the other day, what are sanctions for? Because it was on the radio news here that the European Union is about to bring in another package of sanctions against Russia. And I very quickly, and I'm sure you'll scold me for it, say, essentially, it's to stop nations that are about to do the wrong thing from doing them, or if they're already doing them, to stop them. And in that case, it would be a Russia fail on the international community's part, wouldn't it?
I mean, look, there are two primary kind of reasons to impose sanctions, especially against nation states. There's a slightly separate set of calculations when it comes to like terrorist financiers and things like that. But one, as you noticed, to change behavior, right? Stop doing X and we will give you sanctions relief and you can come back into the international community. Gaddafi, give up your nuclear program, and you can have the world invest in your oil infrastructure. The second piece, though, is isolation. And the essential calculation with Russia is, we are not going to get involved directly in the war with NATO in, going into Ukraine. But we're also not going to sit by and just watch you slaughter Ukrainians. We're going to isolate you economically from the rest of the world. You got, you as Russia and Putin himself, right, got fat and rich off of Western capital and access to Western markets. And you don't deserve that access anymore because you are violating norms of international behavior. And that is a longer term strategy of isolation that eventually could lead to behavior change. I think generally speaking, my supposition on all this is that the way that these sanctions on Russia end is that at some point there is a transition of power in Russia. Putin can't live forever. And somebody will come into power looking at consolidating all of the power centers within Russia. And that's a difficult task. They don't need all the external overhang of sanctions and being isolated from the global economy on top of that. And so I think that's the best hope for change in Russia is after Putin is gone, leaning into whoever comes in behind him to try to kind of convince them to drop the external misadventures and focus on internal issues.
So let's talk about their biggest source of wealth, right? And that is oil. And I was shocked to read that Russia remains on track this month to ship its highest amount of oil products since launching its war on Ukraine earlier this year. I mean, that sounds very contradictory to what sanctions are trying to do.
Yeah, so part of the challenge with sanctions, in particular with a situation that's as fast moving as Russia, is when the initial sanctions happen, the private sector takes a big pause and says, we're just going to hold off, right? One of the reasons Russia has paid or has taken a discount on its oil and other petroleum products since the start of the war is that buyers in the market have been unsure about whether Russian product was going to remain on, right? How long it was going to remain on the market. It's not that easy to set up your supply chains, right? If you're taking, say, 10% of your supply as, 10% is a purely ballpark estimate, right? For some country, and you want to secure that, you want that to be repetitive. You want it to go month over month over month, and that has been up in the air for Russia, especially since the EU package came out several months ago that put in place the prohibitions that kind of underlie this new price cap idea. There is now more stability in the market and more of an understanding that Russian product will remain. So it's actually not that big a surprise that the volumes will remain high. I think the question then is what the revenue is, because that's really the more important thing. Who cares how much they ship? It's what they get.
Right. And that's why the EU keeps going around and around as they're trying to talk about this oil price cap as to what the cap would be. And meantime, the price of oil is falling. And so how do you set an oil price cap, which I want to ask your opinion on, whether you think that can be effective?
I have serious doubts about the effectiveness of the price cap mechanism in kind of working seamlessly. Um, the West, and this has been driven out of Washington. Um, DC wants to see Russian product remain on the market and Russian revenues drop. Um,
So
and
the way
that was
you do that, for people who don't understand what a price cap is, you say, yes, we'll continue to buy your oil, like Europe may still continue to buy it, although they're supposed to stop at a certain point, but they'll continue to buy it, but we're only going to give you so much for it. And that's where a lot of people say, well, the oil price cap really what it amounts to is not limiting the amount of revenue they have, but it's a way of keeping Russian oil on the market.
Yeah, and that remember, this policy came about when oil was at like 120 a barrel, right? So it's down in the 80s now, I believe. And so the price, and people in the U.S. and globally were paying huge prices at the pump for it, and this amidst all the other inflationary pressures, big problem domestically for a lot of politicians.
Can I interrupt you one more time, just to say that Russia's Urals crude oil fell to 51.96 per barrel at the Primorsk Baltic seaport, and that is 20%. I'm reading these numbers because they're not on the top of my head. That's 20% lower than the EU's proposed price cap of $65 a barrel.
Yeah, although Poland apparently is pushing for 30, so who knows where it's gonna shake out.
And the Baltics for 20.
Yeah, and I think look, when I talk about price cap number or price numbers for oil generally, I'm talking about Brent, which is kind of the global standard for where oil is priced. Setting all of that aside, right? You've got this idea that is very complicated to execute, right? OFAC had to put out a big matrix and 12 pages of guidance to inform people how this was going to work. This price cap scheme, in my estimation, is too complicated to function effectively to meet both of those goals, right? Some product will fall off the market potentially, and they may not. It's going to be easy to cheat, right? There is an unregulated sector that is essentially the front line of compliance for this. The people who are responsible for getting information and ascertaining whether it meets the price cap threshold are oil brokers and traders, which many of them have checkered compliance histories, and it's again unregulated, right? If you had a banking system or the insurance sector, both of which are regulated in major Western economies, you might be talking about a different set of kind of regulatory, controls over all of this. All that said, if it doesn't work perfectly, that may not matter in the long run, which is like, this is always the weirdest thing, because mechanically as a policy, I think it's clunky, it's overcomplicated, and I think it's just not going to function effectively in what is a kind of very fluid and opaque market to begin with. But it may not matter, right? If, as you say, right, the Russian Urals is trading at well below the price cap that the Europeans are setting, then Putin can keep selling oil. He can say, he's not, adhering to the price cap, and he won't sell to anybody who does it. Countries like India and China and others can buy that oil under the price cap, and Russian revenues are down. And so it's a very weird, it's almost a bit of a kabuki dance, to be honest. That the way this is kind of shaping up, I think I have all these kind of challenges in my own head about the implementation, the implementability of this policy. But at the end of the day, it may not matter at all,
because the price of oil is falling anyway, and that will slash some of the Russian budget funding arms regardless.
Yeah, I think, and this is the funny part about this, right? As kind of overcomplicated of a policy as this is, all that Washington needs to point to is reduced Russian revenues to say that it works. They can spin a story like that, even if it has nothing to do with the price cap, right? If it has all to do with market forces, all they have to do is point to essentially two things, right? One, reduce prices at the pump for American consumers, and there's some questions about whether they care sufficiently about European consumers as well, although I think they do. And two, reduced revenues to the Kremlin.
Okay, so that's one section of sanctions. The other ones would be things like semiconductors have fallen below 70%, which affects supposedly, I mean, they keep firing them, but supposedly affects Russia's ability to manufacture ballistic missiles, surface-to-air missiles, and other precision weapons, and then other technologies that they use for tanks and heavy artillery and submarines. So people would say, if you're pro-sanction, they would say that in fact is having a bite on the Russian production line.
Yeah, and some of this has like a tangential impact, I think, on the battlefield, as you talk about, with the ability to keep mass producing weapons. There've been reports that they're cannibalizing microwaves and breast pumps for the microchips to launch missiles, right? And there's some hand wringing in the West about whether they should be doing more to stop that. And I think my take is, look, if you're cannibalizing a breast pump to launch a missile, I don't know, that seems like a victory to me.
Maybe there's something in those washing machines that they keep hauling away inside Ukraine and taking home.
Yeah, so that's one thing. But the other piece of the semiconductor ban that's really impairing Russia is the big economy, right? You look at automobile production in Russia and purchases, it's fallen off a cliff. It's like 70%, 75% down. And that is due almost entirely to the shortage of chips, because Russia is, as usual, having to make choices, right? What sanctions do in a lot of ways to a big economy is they force the leadership to make choices about where those resources are going to go, because it makes everything more brittle in economic terms. The Kremlin always chooses its own interests, and in this case, it's building missiles and not helping people.
What aren't we doing right? You're a sanctions guy. When you look at, I know initially you felt that the West was slow to move on sanctions, didn't go far enough, fast enough. What would you say now?
I think the price gap discussion has distracted from implementation and enforcement. Right, there is a pretty substantial amount of kind of sanctions and export controls, since that's what the semiconductors fall under. Pressure on Russia overall, and there's other things they could do, right? They could fully sanction Gazprom Bank and go after other sectors of the Russian economy, but those are less meaningful than going after oil revenues and to a certain extent gas revenues too. But Russia seems to be taking care of that themselves by cutting off gas to Europe. Strategically, they're kind of in the right place, and what they need to do now is really lean into enforcement, right? The Russians are good at evasion techniques, whether it's the breast pump stuff or other things, because they're buying those breast pumps from the West. Looking at ways to shut down Russian sanctions evasion is where everybody needs to pivot to. The U.S. does this fairly well. The U.K. does it okay. Everybody else in Europe doesn't do it at all. And that's where I think a lot of this needs to get to, because Ukraine does, to a certain degree, have the upper hand on the battlefield right now. That needs to be encouraged through policies that support them there and support Ukraine's domestic economy, so that they don't have an economic collapse that threatens their ability to maintain the war itself. And a lot of that right now is around power generation and just basic infrastructure. So that should be kind of the top foreign policy focus, in my view, on the Ukraine war right now, is bolstering Kyiv. I think hurting Russia is a kind of 1A, or maybe goal number 2, but I think bolstering Kyiv is the first, and then leaning in on the enforcement.
So is there one area of enforcement you feel like is key that's not happening? And I know you're being generous with your time and you got to go, but is there one area that you would point to?
I think the semiconductors piece of it is important, because those set of technology controls are new, novel, tested. I think there's a lot of misunderstanding in the private sector about how those are supposed to work, and so I think there's probably a lot of scope for enforcement there. And then I think the other thing too is identifying Russian financial institutions that are basically hiding transactions for the ones that have already been sanctioned. Russia's still transacting across borders. You know, the overall numbers I think are down a little bit from last year in terms of the value of those transactions. But I think, you know, it is almost, I mean, it's almost impossible to believe that Sberbank and VTB are not nesting or hiding transactions through other Russian banks. And so finding those Russian banks and cutting them off, and playing that game of whack-a-mole, I think is the other big step. So I would, if I were the West, those are the two big things that I would be focused on: the financial networks. And,
it's a long game.
It always is. And this is the thing. People want that immediate satisfaction from sanctions because it feels great to release a press release and freeze some money. But sanctions are always a long game.
Brian O'Toole, thank you so much.
Thanks, Dan.